So what we talked about at the beginning was the idea that insulin or IGF1 is bringing IRS1, P85, and PI3 kinase up to the membrane. And once PI3 kinase is up at the membrane, now it converts PIP2 into PIP3. So why is it important that it converts PIP2 into PIP3? Well, PIP3 is unique in that proteins that have a very specific domain in them, called a pH domain, the pH domain of a protein will cause it to bind PIP3. And so now what you've done is you've brought IRS1 to the membrane, you've brought P85 and PI3 kinase to the membrane, and now by producing PIP3, you bring other proteins to the membrane. And the first one is this one, the 3-inositol phosphate dependent protein kinase, or PDK1, the phosphoinositol dependent kinase 1. And so now that's up at the membrane, and another, because it has a pH domain and it can bind to the PIP3, and another protein that has a pH domain is this protein called PKB or AKT. Most people call it AKT. I had my first job at the University of Dundee in Scotland, where they discovered it as the protein kinase B. My first boss there was a guy named Sir Philip Cone, and Sir Philip basically inferred that if I didn't call it PKB, I would be fired from my job. So I call it PKB. I'm still going to call it PKB or AKT a little bit more as I get through into the rest of the quarter. But today we're going to call it PKB or protein kinase B. It could also be called AKT. It's just the same name for two different names for a protein. Okay, so what we've done, brought IRS1 up, brought PI3 kinase up, made PIP2 into PIP3. Now we've got PIP3, so two PIP3 binding proteins are PDK1 and PKB. Now they're up together at the membrane. Oh, look, PDK1 and PKB are up at the membrane. Well, PDK1 is a kinase for PKB. So PDK1, because it's now together with PKB, it can phosphorylate it at a single site here. All right, so that's the first step in activating PKB or AKT. The second step in activating it, it needs another phosphorylation. And what does that? Well, a protein kinase that you've seen before. So this protein kinase, it's mTOR. But again, this is not mTOR complex 1, this is mTOR complex 2. The difference between mTOR complex 1 and 2 were a couple of things. One of the important ones was there's this molecule mSyn1. And mSyn1 has this ability to bring mTOR up to the membrane. So now what you should see is that the only thing that insulin or IGF1 is doing is bringing proteins to the membrane. Because what happens, it binds, you get the receptor dimerization, the receptor phosphorylates, IRS1 comes up, PI3 kinase comes up, PIP2 becomes PIP3. Now you get these two other proteins, PDK1 and PKB, together at the membrane. PKB is now at the membrane where its two activating kinases are. PDK1 phosphorylates it in one spot, mTOR complex 2 phosphorylates at another spot, and now it's been phosphorylated at the two spots that it needs to be phosphorylated to be active. And so now you've activated this protein kinase B, and now it can go on to do its job within the cell. So mTOR complex 2 is going to phosphorylate PKB at this serine 473, and PDK1 is going to phosphorylate at threonine 308. And when those two phosphorylation sites are filled, are phosphorylated, those two sites are phosphorylated, protein is active, and now it can go throughout the cell and do its job. So what is its job? Well, its job is twofold, and its job is to inhibit other proteins. And so one of the proteins that it inhibits is this protein complex here called TSC2. And so it's the TSC complex, or the tubular sclerosis complex. And what it is, it's TSC1 and 2. It's a dimer of two different proteins. You can call it hamartin or tuberin, but it's normally called TSC1 and 2. And what TSC2 is, it's an inhibitor of mTOR complex 1. And what it is, it's a gap protein. Remember, a gap protein is a GTP ACE activating protein. And so a gap protein keeps a small GTPase in the GDP bound or inactive state. And the small GTPase that TSC2 regulates is this GTPase called Reb. And Reb, in the presence of TSC2, is always in a GDP bound inactive state. And Reb is an activator of mTOR. And so when Reb is inactive, because TSC2 is present, it keeps mTOR in this inactive state. Just think of it as an older brother. The older brother is always there keeping the younger brother down. all right, is always pinning him down and punching him and doing all this stuff. That's basically what TSC2 is doing. TSC2 is keeping Reb in its inactive form. The other thing that PKB is able to, and when PKB phosphorylates TSC2, what it does changes the charge of the protein. And when it changes the charge of the protein, it causes it to move away from Reb. And so what happens is PKB phosphorylates TSC2, and TSC2 moves away from Reb. And so when it's away from Reb, now Reb can become active. Okay, so that's the first thing, is that PKB phosphorylates TSC2, dissociates it or moves it away from Reb. Reb can now bind it using a GEF protein, can get rid of GDP. We don't know what the GEF is yet. And then once it gets rid of the GDP, now it can bind GTP and activate mTOR. The other protein that PKB phosphorylates is this protein PRAS40. And PRAS40 serves as an inhibitor of mTOR. The way that it works is that PRAS40, when it's not phosphorylated, it actually goes in and it kind of binds it binds to mTOR in mTOR's kinase domain. And what it does is it prevents mTOR from phosphorylating anything else. It's like having a cork in a bottle of wine. And so what happens when PKB phosphorylates PRAS40 becomes phosphorylated. Those charges change the charge, the phosphorylation changes the charge of PRAS40. The first charge moves it a little bit. mTOR can then phosphorylate it. And now once it's double phosphorylated, poof, out comes the cork. And now, because TSC2 has been phosphorylated and moved away from Reb, Reb's become GTP loaded, mTOR is on, and then PKB phosphorylates PRAS40, mTOR then phosphorylates it again, now PRAS40 moves away, and now you have an active mTOR that's open to phosphorylating other new proteins. Okay, so again, everything just moves up to the membrane, so that what we can do is take PKB, which is spread all throughout the cell, and now put it at the exact spot right here where its two upstream kinases are, and now it can do its downstream job, which is to phosphorylate TSC2, move it away from Reb, and phosphorylate PRAS40 and move it away from mTOR, and now we have mostly active mTOR. And what does mTOR do? The other proteins that it phosphorylates are these proteins, the 4EBP, S6 kinase, and then it's going to regulate some of the LARP proteins, which are going to allow us to translate these 5' top messenger RNA and give us more ribosomal proteins. Okay, so basically how insulin or IGF1 works to activate mTOR is insulin or IGF1 binds to its receptor, dimerizes it, causes autophosphorylation of the receptor. That works as a magnet to bring IRS1 up to the membrane. IRS1 then brings PI3 kinase by interacting with P85 up to the membrane. PI3 kinase at the membrane is right there beside its substrate, PIP2. It turns PIP2 into PIP3. PIP3 is now bound by pH domain containing proteins like PDK1 and PKB. PKB is the important one. PDK1 is the upstream kinase, and it phosphorylates PKB at 308, threonine 308. PKB, because it's up at the membrane and because it's already been phosphorylated at 308, can now be phosphorylated by mTOR complex 2 on serine 473. Once it's doubly phosphorylated, now it can move into the cell, phosphorylate TSC2, move it away from this small GTPase Reb. TSC2's gap activity, the GTPase activating protein activity of it, gap activity is now moved away, so Reb can go from GDP to GTP binding, and that activates Reb, and Reb can then activate mTOR. And the other thing that PKB does is it phosphorylates PRAS40, that loosens the cork. mTOR can then phosphorylate it and pull the cork out, and now Reb can activate mTOR. mTOR can phosphorylate other proteins, such as the 4E binding protein, which increases translation initiation, such as S6 kinase, which can increase both elongation and initiation, and through LARP proteins can regulate these 5' top mRNAs to give us more ribosomal proteins. All of these things together are going to give us more protein synthesis and muscle growth.